So we will be working on 6.3, matrices and system of equations, x negative y minus y equals to 5. So in the previous section, we saw systems of 2 equations. In this section, we're going to see of 2 and 3. But right now, I want you to understand how this becomes a matrix. When we do a matrix, the matrix is going to consist of a column of x's, of y's, and of your answers. So I'm just going to put a number there. So I'm going to take my coefficients. X was 1 here. X was 2 here. Y is a negative 1. Y is a positive 1. And my answers are 5 and 1. The dimension of a matrix is always going to be rows by columns. Rows go sideways, columns go up and down. So how many rows do you see here? 2. And how many columns? 1, 2, 3. So this is a 2 by 3. We're going to learn Gaussian elimination. When we do Gaussian elimination, your goal is to have 1, 0, a random number, a 1, a number, and a number. Your diagonal of 1s with 0s on the bottom right. If it were with 3, it would be 1, 0, 0, number, 1, 0, number, number, 1, number. So, like I said before, this is your column of x's, this is your column of y's, these are your answers, whatever's on the right side of that equal sign. When we have a 3 by 4, we have a column of x, y's, and then we're going to talk about z's, and then we have your whatever's on the right side of the equal sign. So, ways to solve for this, or rules that you have to keep in mind. Well, the first thing you need to see is to see if you could interchange rows. Interchange rows. And I'm going to tell you in a little bit why you would want to do. The next thing that you want to do is make the 1 in a column and then the zeros in that column. So how do you do this? There's 2 steps. First of all, to make a 1, you multiply the row by the reciprocal. That's the first thing. To make the 0, you multiply the row with the 1 by the opposite of the number you want to make a 0 and add it to the row you want to make a 0. So I'm going to give you an easy example right now. Example number 1. Let's say I had 2x plus y equals to 1, x minus y equals to 5. So my matrix here is 2, 1, 1, 1, negative 1, and 5. Now, why would I want to interchange rows? The reason you want to interchange rows is because this bottom one has a 1. And that's what you're trying to get, a 1 up here. So instead of having to multiply and add in everything, I could just interchange them. So this becomes 1, negative 1, 5, 2, 1, 1. So that's the first thing, interchange. Now, after you interchange, because sometimes, so we don't have to worry about making the 1 because you already have it, right? But I have to worry about making a 0. To make a 0, you multiply the row with the 1 by the opposite number of the number you want to make a 0. So who do I want to make a 0? This guy. So it says to take the 1. Where is the 1 at? In row 1. Take row 1, and that's what R1 stands for. Take row 1 and multiply by the opposite of the number you want to make a 0. So the opposite of 2 is negative 2. The opposite of 2 is negative 2. You want to make, and add it to the row where you want to make the 0. And add it to the row. What row do I want to make the 0 in? Row 2. Now here I am doing no changes to row 1, so I'm not going to write anything there, but I'm going to follow this. Negative 2 times row 1, who was in row 1 here? A 1, plus my number in row 2, which is a 2. Negative 2 times row 1, now I'm going to the second column, so negative 2 times row 1, who's in row 1? A negative 1, plus who's in row 2? A 1, my little line. Negative 2 times who's in my row 1? 5, plus who's in my row 2? 1. So what is my new matrix going to be? Once again, I did this for every single thing. Negative 2 times row 1 plus row 2, negative 2 plus row 1 plus row 2, negative 2 plus times row 1 plus row 2. I didn't do anything to the top, so that one stays the same. We just bring it down. We plug this into the calculator. Negative 2 times 1 plus 2, and we get the 0, and that was the whole reason we did this whole operation, to get a 0. That means we did it right. Negative 2 times negative 1 plus 1, and my answer is 3. Negative 2 times 5 plus 1, my answer is negative 9. So I have accomplished the 1 and the 0 here. The only thing I have to do now is make this guy a 1, because remember, this is what you're trying to make it look like, a diagonal of 1s with the 0 on the bottom left. Diagonal of 1s with the 0 on the bottom left. So it says, to make a 1, you multiply the row by the reciprocal. So which row am I trying to make the 1 in? Row 2. And it says to multiply by the reciprocal of this. The reciprocal of 3 is 1/3. Once again, I am not doing anything to row 1. Row 1 stays put. So 1/3 times row 2. 1/3 times row 2. 1/3 times row 2. So I took everything in row 2 and I multiplied by 1/3. I didn't do anything to the top row, so that one stays. 1/3 times 0, 0. 1/3 times 3, 1. 1/3 times a -9, -3. And if you're not sure, use your calculator, whether it's this one or a graphing one. There's that -3, 1/3 times 3, there's the 1. So have I accomplished my diagonal of zeros and the bottom, my diagonal of ones and the bottom of 0. Now remember, I told you this is x, this is y, and this is your answer. So when I look at this, I have the equation x minus y equals to 5, but I also have an equation of just y equals -3. So I already got the answer right there. Y equals -3. 1y equals -3. I could use this, plug it in here, x minus a -3 equals to 5, x plus 3 equals to 5, because that negative and the minus together make it a positive. I subtract 3, x is 2. So my answer is 2, -3. So we're solving the system, except we have to use Gaussian elimination. Let's try another one in this section. 2x plus y equals to 1. 3x plus 2y equals to -2. So first we write it as a matrix. 2, 1, 1, 3, 2, -2. So we just take the coefficients and the answers. Please remember that your goal is for it to be 1, 0, number 1, number. That's your goal right now. So can I interchange here? Do I have a 1 here if I move it to the top? No. So the first thing is we have to make a 1. Go back to your rules. To make a 1, you multiply the row by the reciprocal. Multiply the row by the reciprocal. So I want to make this guy a 1. The reciprocal of 2 is 1/2, and I'm going to multiply row 1 by 1/2. So multiply the row by the reciprocal of the number you're trying to make a 1. 1/2 times row 1, 1/2 times row 1, 1/2 times row 1. Now, we didn't do anything to the bottom, so it's going to stay. We don't have to do anything. We're only working with row 1. Half of 2 is 1. Half times 1 is 1/2. Half times 1 is 1/2. We didn't do anything to row 2, so I'm just going to go here and copy it down. And now I work from here. You never go back to the original. Now you're working from here. So here we just went to the previous one. So we don't go back to the original. Forget this. This is your new one. So I have a 1, but now I have to make this guy a 0. I have to make the 3 a 0. Let's read the instructions again. To make a 0, you multiply the row with the 1 by the opposite of the number you want to make a 0. So which row has a 1? Row 1. What's the opposite of the number that I'm trying to make a 0? The opposite of 3 is -3. So multiply the row with the 1 by the opposite of the number you want to make a 0. I got it. Then add it to the row where you want to make the 0. So I'm going to add it to row 2, because that's where I want to make the 0, in row 2. So I am not changing row 1 right now. I'm just working with row 2. -3, right, times row 1, which is a 1, plus my row 2, which is a 3. -3 times who's in my row 1? 1/2 plus who's in my row 2? 2. -3 times my row 1 plus who's in my row 2? A -2. Now, I did not do anything to row 1, so I'm going to rewrite that 1, 1/2, and 1/2. I'm going to take my calculator to put this in, especially because of those crazy fractions. So, -3 let me turn it on first. -3 parentheses 1 plus 3. My answer is 0. Perfect. I got a 0. That's what I wanted. Then I have -3 parentheses 1/2 plus 2. The answer is 0.5, which is the same thing as 1/2. And then I have -3 parentheses 1/2 plus a -2. My answer is -3.5. So you could write it as a -3.5. You could write it as a fraction, which is -7/2. Whichever way, it's okay. So I have the 1 and 0, what I want. But now I want to make this into a 1. So what is the rule to make a 1? To make a 1, you multiply the row by the reciprocal. So this is row 2. So row 2 has to be multiplied by the reciprocal of 1/2, which is 2. So that means that I have 1. Oh, sorry, I'm not doing anything to row 1. I have 2 times 0, 1/2 times, it should be 2 times 1/2. 2 times 1/2. 2 times 1/2, and I have 2 times -3.5. I didn't do anything to row 1, so I will continue. Whether you use 1/2 or 0.5, it's still the same thing. 2 times 0 is 0. Perfect. 2 times 1/2 is 1. Perfect. 2 times -3.5 is -7. Perfect. So we're good. So right now, remember, once you have 1 in diagonal and a 0 there, you're done. X, Y, and this is your answer. So my two equations coming from here, 1x plus half y equals to 1/2, and my other equation is y equals -7, because this is a y, because it's in the column of y, equals to a -7. So this is done, but I need to come back and plug it over here. X plus 1/2 times -7 equals to 1/2. X plus -7/2 equals to 1/2. And if you're not sure and you want to make these into decimals, times -7, it's a -3.5, which is a -7/2. -3.5 is the same thing. I want to add 7/2, add 7/2. So I get x equals 1/2 plus 7/2, which is a 4. So my answer, 4, -7. 4, -7. Let's try one more. So let's say I had x minus 4y equals to 9. 2x plus 5y equals to 5. We do our matrix. 1, -4, 9, 2, 5, 5. So remember, your goal is 1, 0, number 1, number. Your diagonals of 1. Well, look, I already have a 1, so I don't have to worry about that. I just need to make this guy a 0. How do we make that a 0? Let's keep reading that. To make a 0, you multiply the row with the 1 by the opposite number you want to make a 0. So what row has a 1? Row 1. What's the opposite of 2? Negative 2. And then we add it to the row where we want to make the 0, which is row 2. So we're not changing row 1. Once again, row 1 times the opposite of this plus row 2. So negative 2 times a row 1, which is a 1, plus 2. Your negative 2 times your row 1, which is a negative 4, plus row 2. Your negative 2 times row 1, which is a 9, plus your row 2. We didn't do anything to the top, so we keep it the same. We grab our calculator to type in these things. Negative 2 parentheses 1 plus 2. My answer is 0. Perfect. Negative 2 times a negative 4 plus 5. My answer is 13. Perfect. Negative 2 times 9 plus 5. My answer is negative 13. So I have a 1, 0. Now the only thing, so this looks like this, I have to make this into a 1. So to make a 1, you multiply the row by the reciprocal. Well, what's the reciprocal of 13? 1/13 is the reciprocal of 13. It looks like a bad 13. 1/13 times which row? Row 2. So 1/13 times 0, 1/13 times 13, and 1/13 times a negative 13. We didn't do anything with the top, so 1, negative 4, 9. We work with the bottom. And of course, 1 divided by 13 times 0 is 0. 1 divided by 13 times 13, 1. 1 divided by 13 times a negative 13, negative 1. So I have a 0, 1, negative 1. Once you have this diagonal of 1s and the zeros, this is your x, this is your y, this is your answer. So I have 1x minus 4y equals to 9. And then over here I have my y equals a negative 1. So that part is done. So that means this negative 1, I have to plug it in here. Negative, negative becomes a positive, so plus 4 equals to 9. I subtract 4, and I get that x is 5. So my answer, 5, negative 1. So these are some examples for 2 by 3s. We're going to go into a 3 by 4 in a little bit. So we're going to do example number 2. And this is a 3 by 4. So remember, your goal for this one is 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, so here I have my 1s, and zeros right below it. So let's say this is a problem you get. 2x minus y plus 4z equals negative 3. X minus 2y minus 10z equals to a negative 6. 3x plus 4z equals to 7. So the first thing would be to write down the matrix for this. So remember, it's your column of x's, column of y's, column of z's, and then I'm going to have my answers, right? So here I have a 2, a 1, and a 3. This is a -1, -2. There's no y, so we're going to put a 0. There's a 4, a -10, a +4, and then my answers are -3, -6, and 7. So when I look at this, remember, your goal, have a 1 on top. So when I look at my 3 rows, first possibility is for you to interchange. So the question here is, would us interchanging make this a little bit easier? And it should be yes. If I interchange these 2 rows, so I'm gonna interchange row 1 and row 2. When I do that, my first one becomes 1, -2, -10, 2, -1, 4, -3, 3, 0, 4, 7. Now, how did this help? Because guess what? I already have a 1. This is why you want to interchange, because of that 1 right there. So now that I have a 1, I have to worry about making the zeros below. The rule to make a 0 is you take the row that has the 1, which is row 1, you multiply by the opposite of the number you're trying to make a 0. I'm trying to make this one a 0. What's the opposite of 2? -2 times row 1, because that's where I have the 1. And then you add it to the row. Which row am I trying to make a 0? Row 2. So then I am going to work on this. I'm not doing anything to row 1. So -2 times row 1, which is 1, plus my row 2. -2 times my row 1 plus my row 2. -2 times my row 1 plus my row 2. -2 times row 1 plus my row 2. My row 1 and my row 3, there are no changes. So when I come over here, I could go ahead and rewrite those. 1, -2, -10, -6, 3, 0, 4, and 7. Grab your calculator to calculate this. -2 times 1 plus 2, the 0 we've been wanting. Yep. -2 parentheses -2 plus a -1. I get a +3. -2 times a -10 plus 4. I get a +24. -2 times a -6 plus a -3. I get a +9. So now this is the matrix I'm looking at. I have the 1, I have the 0, but because this matrix is bigger, I have to now make this into a 0 also. So to make this a 0, I have to take the row with the 1, which is row 1, multiply times the opposite of this. Opposite of 3 is a -3, and add it to the row where I want to make the 0, and it is in row 3. So for my row 3, -3 times my row 1 plus row 3, -3 times my row 1 plus my row 3, negative 3 times my row 1 plus my row 3, negative 3 times my row 1 plus my row 3. I did not do anything to rows 1 and 2, so I'm going to copy those directly the way they are up here. 0, 3, 24, and 9. So what is negative 3 times 1 plus 3, the 0 we were looking for? Negative 3 times negative 2 plus 0 is positive 6. Negative 3 times a negative 10 plus 4 is a positive 34. And negative 3 times a negative 6, I'm sorry if you weren't seeing that, just type it into your calculator and see. So I'm just typing these thingies, plus 7, which is a 25. So this is what we have right now. 1, 0, 0, 0. So remember, this is the part where you concentrate. The next thing is I have to make this guy into a 1. So we have to make that one a 1. To make a 1, we multiply times the reciprocal. So my row 2 times the reciprocal of 3, which is a 1/3. So we're not doing anything to the top or the mid or the last row. So I just have 1/3 times 0, 1/3 times 3, 1/3 times 24, 1/3 times 9. 1, negative 2, negative 10. We didn't do anything to the top or last row, so I'm going to keep those the same. 1/3 times 0, 0. 1/3 times 3, 1. 1/3 times 24, 8. 1/3 times 9, 3. So I'm looking at this. Check, 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 check. Now I have to make this guy into a 0. So the rule says multiply the 1. So now I'm dealing with the 1 in this column, and it's in row 2, times the opposite of the number you're trying to make a 0. So I have to use this one because this is it's right above the 6 that I'm trying to make a 0. So that's negative 6 times row 2 plus, what row am I trying to make the 0 in? Row 3. So which row changes? Your row 3. Negative 6 times my row 2 plus my row 3. Negative 6 times my row 2 plus my row 6. My row 3, sorry. Negative 6 times row 2 plus my row 3. Negative 6 times row 2 plus my row 3. I did not do anything to the top 2 rows, so I'm going to copy them straight from here. So it is a long process. You have to be careful. Negative 6 times 0 plus 0, the answer is 0. Negative 6 times 1 plus 6, the answer is 0. Negative 6 times 8 plus 34, oops, I put negative 6 times 8 plus 34, answer is negative 14. Negative 6 times 3 plus 25, the answer is 7. So now this is what I have. So the last thing I want to do is make this guy into a 1. So how do we make that into a 1? The reciprocal of this, which is a negative 1/14 times row 3. negative 1/14 times 0, negative 1/14 times 0, negative 1/14 times a negative 14, and a negative 1/14 times a 7. We didn't do anything to the top two rows. 1, negative 2, negative 10, negative 6, 0, 1, 8, 3. 1/14 times 0, 0. 1/14 times 0, 0. Negative 1/14 times a negative 14, a 1. And in case you're not sure, negative 1/14 times a negative 14, there's your 1. Negative 1/14 times a 7, the answer is a negative 0.5. or a negative 1/2, whichever way you want to do it. So please remember, this is your X, this is your Y, this is your Z, and these are your answers. So I'm having to go to the next page and continue there. Now, I have 3 equations here. My first equation, so once you accomplish your 1s with the zeros below it, you have to write down the equations that you have. In this case, it would be 1x minus 2y minus 10z. 1x minus 2y minus 10z equals negative 6, right? I have a 1y plus 8z equals to 3. But I also have a 1z equals to a negative 0.5. So 1, negative 2, negative 10 equals to negative 6. This comes from this part. 1y plus 8z equals to 3, and then z equals to negative 0.5. So from here, this is already solved. I'm done. But you're going to use this and you're going to plug it in here. Y plus 8 times a negative 0.5 equals to 3. What is 8 times a negative 0.5? It's a negative 4. So y minus 4 equals to 3. Add 4, and I have y is 7. So now these two together, I'm going to use them into this one. So both of these, this now goes here and this one goes there. So I have x minus 2 times 7 minus 10 times negative 0.5 equals to a negative 6. X minus 14 and a negative 10 times a negative 0.5 is a positive 5, plus 5 equals to negative 6. Negative 14 plus 5 is a negative 9. So this is x minus 9 equals a negative 6. I add 9, x is a 3. So my final answer here, 3, 7, negative 0.5, or 3 and a negative 1/2. Depending if they say decimal or fraction is what you're going to plug in. So that would be your answer for this problem.